Hey everybody, we are continuing with my review of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and now we are on the second one, so this is my review for The Two Towers. This film came out in 2002, and it was directed by Peter Jackson, of course. Middle films of a trilogy often struggle, or it's harder for them to find their voice, because naturally they're not going to be as memorable typically as, your beginning, where you're beginning the story, making this big statement, or making that big statement at the end, that conclusion. But as a kid, I do recall this being maybe my favorite of all of the films. But returning to it as an adult, I do have a bit of a different perspective. I don't quite find the same kind of romanticism as I did originally. This one does feel a little bit more muddled. It feels less focused. There are less clarified arcs here. And the arcs that they do have just aren't as resonant typically as they are in the first film. It does suffer, of course, from that inconsistent pacing because, it is Peter Jackson. And yet, there are things in this film that I admire a great deal. There are scenes in this film and elements in this film that to me are the greatest in the entire trilogy. For sure, the consistency throughout this trilogy is that yes, there are a lot of highs and then there are a lot of lows as well. I will say what's notable about this film tonally compared to the first film, yes, it is definitely darker. You can feel that kind of brooding tension for sure that is kind of hovering above it, which is what you want from a second film, especially, a trilogy such as this that is, epic like this. But at the same time, I mentioned how the first one felt more like Gone with the Wind. It had that kind of very melodramatic, old Hollywood sort of cartoonishness to it, but there's a charm to that. This film felt a little bit more like a John Sturges film, which doesn't work as well for me. Certainly those films have their charm, not denying that, but this film did remind me at times of like The Great Escape, which is a film that, for sure foregoes any logic or any, like true historical context or anything. And it gives way for more like action schlock and, more of those cheap Hollywood showcases, those gimmicks. Yes, they do have a charm to them, but for me, it feels more removed, I think, than from what I wanted the Lord of the Rings trilogy to be, that sophisticated, more subtle filmmaking. But yes, this film does simplify its characters more than in the first one. Yes, they are simple in the first film, for sure, a lot of them. And yes, they do employ gimmicks in that one, but in a way that is a lot less glaring as it is in this one. It works a bit more for me because it's a little more subtle, it's a little more invisible. But here, what they have with the character of Aragorn as an example, for Legolas and Gimli, they kind of make them more action stars. I'm thinking of like Steve McQueen on his motorcycle trying to outrun the Nazis, and yeah, he's a badass. Having Aragorn be like this big action hero, and then you've got like Gimli being like the comic relief and such, and that Legolas surfing down the staircase thing while he's, shooting them arrows is just, it's unforgivable. Oh my God, is it unforgivable? But, at the same time, I kind of see why they went that route because, to a certain point, you do have to simplify these types of big epic films, as I've mentioned before. We can't make films like Lawrence of Arabia like we could, decades ago. At a certain point, you have to sacrifice that subtlety and that elegance because that's just not what's successful in this day and age. Everything, and it's been this way my whole life. Anything I think post Star Wars had to really change. We couldn't have cerebral science fiction as an example anymore. You can for TV, smaller scale. So it's like you've got Star Trek: The Next Generation, for an example, and like, Picard is supposed to be this, like more cerebral, academic, calm, collected person. But then in the movies, when it's suddenly meant to be a cinematic experience, we're just going to throw all that out the window. Really dramatic and completely out of character, and he's going to turn into this like trigger-happy Bruce Lee knockoff, and it just feels wrong. And that's how I feel about what they're doing here with, with the Lord of the Rings characters. So it's not as bad as it was done, I think, in Star Trek at times, but, the flavors are there. And I think part of it, too, is this film, as I said, it is darker than the first film for sure. You can feel that desperation, that struggle that is imminent here. And so when you have Aragorn like diving off a ladder into a crowd of like Uruk-hai, it just, it sort of takes you out of things. Though at times, yes, I think they do achieve a little bit more of that balance that they do, like with the first one, with the cartoonish, more nostalgic elements of it. And, like as an example, when Sam and Frodo eventually get to Mordor in the second one, and they're right in front of the gates, that scene and just Mordor in general has that foreboding, like mercurial energy to it that reminds me of like the Wizard of Oz or something, like the third act of Wizard of Oz. Very committed to what it's doing there. I think when they're committed, it really does show. Those are some of the best moments in all the films. But yes, I think part of why it just feels less effective to me, at least this time around, is because I think it's just harder to put that hero's journey within a middle film, especially when your main character, Frodo, is more taking a back seat to the things that are happening. This is more a focus on Aragorn's story. And I feel like even though they attempt to capture that climactic build of the first one, it's just not there. I talked about in the original how the first half of it suffers from being overstuffed, and there's a lot of kind of forced conclusions in the scenes and quite abrupt scenes, and yet it really grows and becomes to resonate more and more emotionally. It gets more clear. But part of why is because they trimmed a lot of that gratuity, whereas with this one, it's definitely building, for sure, in a way. It is building to this big climax where you're going to get to Helm's Deep, this huge, huge battle, and hopefully, tonally, your three stories of the Fellowship all broken away are going to intersect, at least emotionally, in the same way, hopefully, if it works out. The way that they do intersect just doesn't really work. I think a lot of, going back and forth, say, between like Merry, Pippin, and the Ents story, and then going back into the Helm's Deep battle, it really just breaks up a lot of the tension of it. And it's like, cool, yeah, I've always just wanted a harrowing battle sequence to stop right in the middle, really in a jarring way, so we can just go to awkward silences. I think part of it too is that the battle, for all its buildup, it goes on too long. Yes, it has a lot of great moments in it, but it's just too repetitive. And yes, it's too long. And I think if you'd shortened it a little bit, I think a lot of those intersecting storylines could have had more flow in the third act. So yeah, that aspect of it did not quite hold up as well as I wanted it to. That being said, when it comes to very compelling moments of this movie, there are quite a few. I think the opening of this film, the first scene, is maybe the best in the entire trilogy. It's just great going right into the the Gandalf death sequence again, or I should say death sequence, and following him down. I think is just really dramatic. It's a big statement. It's exactly what your viewer wants to see. It's very clear. It kind of gives us that backstory and everything. All that's very strong. But no question here, the strongest element of The Lord of the Rings, and certainly the strongest element of The Two Towers, is Smeagol, Gollum. It's a mix of things. It's a lot of artists collaborating together to create something that I really do feel is magic. And I think it's also a huge part of it is Andy Serkis, his commitment to the role, how much he inspired how they would develop the role. And it's amazing. Serkis really was a revelation, like he did, when Peter Jackson saw his audition where he's just snarling and spitting and he's just getting so into the character, it's guttural and everything. He realized like, wow, he's got to play the character on set. He's got to be the character because so much of the physicality of the voice comes out and all of that. And, that was never, he was just going to do the voice originally. And so being able to merge both like a real actor, the physicality of a real actor's performance, and paint over their facial expressions so that, their performance is still there, but you have this, melding of computer effects. I think they just took the character very seriously. I use the word commitment a lot while reviewing this trilogy, but this is absolute commitment. I think you can tell that the creators here really love Gollum. They really respect him. I think that they see that he is the most compelling character in the books, and he is maybe the best written character. The most tragic. It's very Shakespearean, and I think it would be a dream for a really accomplished actor to play because you have so much complexity to work off of. But it's everything. It's the eyes, it's the design, it's the bony fingers and everything. I remember seeing it as a kid and I don't remember how everybody else felt, but I just remember being amazed that special effects could achieve something like this. And I think it for the most part holds up very, very well. When do you ever see a character like this, done with CGI and all of that, being able to hold his or her own in a film? You never see that. I've never seen it done as well as it is in Lord of the Rings. You might have CGI characters for comic relief in a comic book movie or something, but none with the depth of a Smeagol. And I love how the film really takes those scenes, expands those scenes where we really get to delve into what makes Smeagol, really getting into his minds, and they're really playing up kind of the trauma and kind of, the mental instability of him. He's clearly very deranged and he's been psychologically, physically abused, and the mystery of him is always intriguing because he's always kind of kept at bay. We don't quite know a lot about his past. And of course, with Andy Serkis, that physicality is just full on. I mean, he threw his body into it in a way that I think is really admirable. And he's able to capture all those aspects, the humor for sure, how pathetic he is, how creepy, how violent. He's a very surprising character, so I can't say enough about how much I love him in this. And I think Andy Serkis is a very underrated actor. I know he's known for these kinds of roles, and he's found that, and he's really capitalized on it throughout his career, but I think, people don't realize how great of an actor that he truly is. And I think this is one of the best performances in the whole trilogy, next to maybe Ian McKellen. I think the attention to the world building here also is really admirable, as always. My favorite thing here, I think, is Rohan. It's just gorgeous, and that they built everything out there in the mountains is just amazing. That is a type of authenticity that you just can't recreate yet. You just can't. And the Rohirrim, like the musical theme, is quite beautiful, quite memorable. So I would say all of that stuff remains top notch. I just wish the same attention to detail and structuring was evident here as it was in the first film, because once you get to the end of that film, once you are at that big climactic point, yes, it is, a large spectacle visually and all of that, and it is satisfying to a degree, but because it suffers from a lot of those pacing issues, and again, the arcs aren't quite as resonant here, when Sam gives that big speech at the end, it felt a little bit lacking for me. It doesn't have the same effect as a Boromir dying for me, and that transition of going into the Fellowship is breaking up. So yeah, I think with this one, I noticed a real mixed bag this time. It is a little bit all over the place. The issues, as I said, are more glaring here, and yet there are things about it that I absolutely adore. I can't tell you how much I love Gollum, but I think Gollum is a huge reason for the success of The Lord of the Rings. It's not the only reason, but I think it's a big part of it. And that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will plug my website. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist. I do commission portraits, and I sell prints of my work, my drawing stuff. And if you're interested in buying one, or if you're interested in a commission, you can always go to the website and go to the shop. And if you have any questions about a commission or something, you want to talk to me about it, you can always email me. The email's in the description box below. If you would like to join Patreon, here are my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for all your dedication. The link to become a patron is below, and my social media information is below that. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.